Hello everyone. I have the extreme privilege today of sitting with Mr. E. Daniel Long. I'm going to ask him a few questions to share with you, but I first and foremost want to point out to all of you that if you need uplifting, stay tuned. Mr. Long.
Dan, please.
Thank you. What made you decide to become a music teacher?
Oh, Janice, that's a wonderful question. Thank you for giving me the opportunity of talking about Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson was my high school band and choir teacher. I came from a little town in the middle of the sandhills of Nebraska, Mullen, Nebraska, population 490, and this was a community where you had everybody had to do everything. We played six-man football. We played. We had five on a team for basketball. We did have enough for that, but we had to be in the. Everybody was in the choir and everybody was in the band. We had no orchestras, and Mr. Thompson taught everything, and he was just a wonderful man. And even to this day, I still keep in contact with him. And he's one of these people that made a huge impression on me and impacted my life forever. And one day I came home from school and I said to my mother and father, I want to be just like Mr. Thompson. And my mom looked at me, she said, you want to be a music teacher? I said, oh, I do, Mom. And she said, and both she and my dad says, great, great. And that was the beginning, he planted the seed for me to become a teacher. Then I went back to school. I was a junior in high school. And I said, Mr. Thompson, I want to be a music teacher. And he said, well, the thing that you've got to do, because he knew I didn't know how to do it. He said, the first thing you've got to do is learn how to play the piano. To be a music teacher, you've got to know how to play the piano. We didn't even have a piano. So I went home and I said to my folks, I said, Mr. Thompson told me that we need to have a piano and I need to start taking lessons. And my dad says, I wonder what happened to Grandma's piano. That was his mother. So we made a couple of phone calls and discovered that sure enough, Grandma's piano was on a ranch about 100 miles away, sitting out on the porch. No one had played it for years and years, but it was still there. So my father and I jumped in our pickup and we had an old tarp and a few ropes, and we drove out to this ranch, and everybody around helped us get this piano hefted into the pickup, put the tarp on it just in case it would rain on the way back home, because it was, a couple of hours drive 100 miles away. We roped that piano on the back of the pickup and brought it home, and my mother had already moved the furniture around in the living room so that there was a spot for the piano. And so we drove that piano. It wasn't big, tall, huge, big upright pianos, and of course horribly out of tune. And so we called Mrs. Licking, who was the only piano teacher in town. And Mrs. Licking said, "You have a piano at your house?" And we said, "Well, just got it." So she came up. She brought her tuner with the big handles on it, because not only did she teach piano, she tuned them. And so she tuned the piano as close as she could get it, made it better. And she said, well, let's have your first lesson right now. So we sat down and off we went. And that was the beginning of my learning how to play the piano. And sure enough, I took lessons from Mrs. Licking for the next 2 years. And then I had a very unique experience. When I graduated from high school, I went off to, as you said, to Chadron State College. And in those days, it was called Chadron State Teachers College. And it was about 150 miles away. And so off I went. I was going to be a teacher. Well, when I was a senior, Mr. Thompson said, you need to know that I have resigned as the teacher here in Mullen because I'm going back to school to get a music major. He had a music minor degree and got this job teaching in Mullen and loved it. He said, I'm going to go back and complete my major in music. So he said, I'm going to go back to Chadron. So you and I will now become classmates. And so for my freshman year, which was the only year that we overlapped, he and his wife and their then little girl They spent their first year in Chadron with me, and I would go over to their house every Sunday night and have dinner with them, and he'd talk about what we had done for the day or for the week. And so we'd pass on the halls, and it was so strange for me to see my teacher as now a classmate, as part of the campus there at Chadron, and I loved every bit of it. Yeah.
Sounds wonderful.
It was.
What are some highlights of your teaching career?
Highlights of my career. You know, the highlights of my career are things that happen to me all the time. It's things like just last night, you and we went to a concert. And it was a concert where we enjoyed the most fabulous performance of Sir Simon Rattle and the Berlin Philharmonic. And among other things, they played Brahms' Second Symphony. And at intermission, I'm standing in the hallway, in the mezzanine of Hill Auditorium, right by Dr. Ravelli. There's a portrait of Dr. Ravelli there. And that's where I always stand during intermissions. And sure enough, as predicted, I met. There were some students who came up and said, "Oh, hi, Mr. Long, you're here," and we chatted and we did this and that. I knew you'd be here. My highlights are those moments when I see a student at a concert. They may not be playing their instrument. They may not have any performance in their life, but music is still a part of their life. And my highlights are every one of those moments. Or I'll see a child walking down the street, I call him a student walking down the street, and we stop and we chat. And how are you? Oh, I've got 3 kids, and I've got this, and I've got that. And they talk about their children. And then they say, oh, and my son is now playing the instrument or that. That's a highlight. They've passed on their love of music to their own children. These are people who are members of a community who are saying music has got to be an important part of our community's lives, and I'm doing my best to see that that happens. And those are my highlights. Those children and those students who come to you years later, and I saw you even last night. I'm going to sort of put in a plug for my interviewer here. Here was Mrs. Peterson downstairs in the lobby of Hill Auditorium enjoying another highlight of her own career with students who found her out, and there they were. They had spent their last hard-earned $5 or 10 or whatever it was to come to the concert, and that's a great moment of our life, a highlight.
Yes. What words of advice do you have for young teachers in the profession?
Words of advice. Well, a couple of things. You've got to remember now, I spent, of my 40 years of teaching, 35 were at the middle school, junior high level. I need to say that first. So I'm talking about my experiences working with students that are from ages 12 to 16. And that is an exciting part of a child's life. And for parents, they might not say exciting. They might say, I just as soon skip middle school and then just go right to high school. But nevertheless, I love that. I love that. So I need to say that first. Now, that said, here's the advice. You must sometimes take what children say with a grain of salt. Because sometimes they'll just burst forth with things that are, particularly if they're on the negative side of life, you can't take them seriously because they don't really. It'll only last for that moment. They go on. So you have to make sure that you weigh what students say. You must maintain a fantastic sense of humor. You must do that. But another part of my thought process here in terms of advice, you've got to get into their lives. To understand them, you've got to get out of the music rehearsal room. You've got to get outside music to see what children are doing, to see what other parts of their activities and the other things that they're doing in their life. Don't just look upon them as music students in your classroom. You must get beyond that. You must look far beyond that. And I'll tell you where someone who really spoke well about it. His name is Benjamin Zander. Benjamin Zander wrote a book called The Art of Possibility. And in that book, he talks about how you need to get into children's lives, and you need to ask them to show you what their interests and what their ideas and what captivates them. And so some of my advice is to explore ways to get students to tell you what's going on inside their head. And that's such an important ingredient. Well, I'm going to give you an example of this very kind of thing of an advice, and how to get them to express outwardly what they feel inwardly, because that's really what music making is all about. You are sitting there and you're playing your instrument and doing whatever you're doing or singing. You are trying to show outwardly some of your inner feelings. And again, Mr. Zander gave me this great hint, this great suggestion. It's called the White Pages. And in the White Pages, he says you need to explore, have them write. So, and he told me what he did. So I thought, oh, this is a good idea. So I implemented this in my rehearsals. And these students, when they would come into my room on a given day, they would see that there were half pages of white paper with nothing written on it on their music stands. And oh, this is a white page day. And they'd get so excited. And about 10 minutes before the end of the rehearsal, I would say, okay, everybody, have a nice weekend or have a nice day and I'll see you next week, kind of thing. Because sometimes I would do these on Fridays. Friday was always sometimes the crazy day and things going on, and so you just said, okay, this is a good day to do it. And I would leave the room, still with maybe 10 minutes left in the time. So I would leave. They would pack up their instruments and they'd pull out their pencils and they'd start writing. Write. And at the end of the time, someone would gather up all these papers and the bell would ring and he or she would come in and say, okay, you have a nice weekend too, Mr. Long. And they'd lay these papers down, hand them to me. And I would pick all these things up. I'd take them home with me and bring my scores with me. And I'd start reading these papers. Because what was on these papers was such things as, what have we accomplished since the last time we wrote, which was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, because I didn't do it weekly. What have we accomplished? What do we need to work on? What are some of the things that we need to do to make the music sound better? They would actually start writing things down, and you would be amazed at the things that they heard and how they perceived them, and they would write them down. Now sometimes they say, oh, don't ever wear that tie with that shirt that you wore on Wednesday. It looked awful. And they had some humorous things too. But most of the time, it addressed what was going on in the music. And I'll never forget, I love to use this example. There was one of the sheets said, Mr. Long, the cellos are not coming in well at letter C, or whatever it was in this particular piece. And you need to give us a better cue. If you'll cue us, we'll have the confidence to come in and you'll be happier and so will we. So I wrote in my music, cue cellos at letter C. Well, the next time we rehearsed on that particular piece, I saw that, cue the cellos, and I immediately remembered that sheet of paper. So I looked over at the cellos and I gave the biggest gesture of a cue I could possibly give. And from the very back of the cello section was this smile that was about this wide, and here was one of the, not the very best cello players in the section, and she was sitting there saying to me with her smile, he read my sheet. He cares what I have to say. He listened to me. And she sat up about 4 inches taller in her chair and tried to do her best and fix her bow arm or do whatever she needed to do, because she knew that I cared about her in that orchestra. Even as with her, whatever ability she had, he cared about me. So some of my advice then to these young people is find ways to build the bridges, to make connections with your students, and do that in every way possible.